Good evening. My name is Phyllis Italiano, and I want to welcome you to our show called The Needs of the Community, The Democratic View. And over a period of time, I'm going to be presenting to you the candidates who are from the Democratic Committee and will be running for all of the different positions that are open for this coming election in November. My first guest is Peter Van Scoyoc, and here he is right now. And Peter, I know you have a very famous name in this community, and I would like to find out something about that name. Can you tell us about your name?
Sure. First of all, I'd like to thank you for having me on the show, and I'd like to thank LTV. We're very fortunate to have a local television station like LTV in the community so that we can air such broadcasts. As far as my family goes, we have roots in New York that go back to 1636, part of the original Dutch settlement in Manhattan. By the fifth generation, members of my family had moved to East Hampton. Isaac Van Scoy, who settled in Northwest Woods, was one of the first European settlers to live in that part of town. The original settlements were closer to Ockabonic Creek and to where our hamlet of the village of East Hampton is now. And when they first moved there, he was actually brought up in town by his maternal grandparents, whom he was named after, Isaac Barnes, because his father had married Patience Barnes about 1720 in Oyster Bay, Long Island. So he settled in Northwest. His first home was built there with his young wife, Mercy Edwards. They lived in basically what was a log-covered, sod-roofed lean-to dug into the hillside. And within about 2 or 3 years, they had built a framed house and raised 8 children who survived on that farm, which was about 180 acres at the time. So, and there's, at this point, that was located right on Northwest Road, across from what's now the Grace Estate. The Grace Estate contains a large portion of what was the original farm, and Grassy Hollow, which is to the south of that side of the road, contains now the location of the schoolhouse, which was built on land that was donated by the Van Scoy family, Isaac, to school children in Northwest, because by the latter half of the 1700s, there actually was a thriving community in Northwest, which is kind of odd when you think about it now, because that's the area of town that's probably the least developed, and there are huge tracts of what looks like virgin forest, but it's not.
It's not because
most of those trees were felled and cleared for farmland over the course of the next 100 years. By probably the post-Civil War era, like 1870s, 1880s, farming had pretty much played out in Northwest. The soils were not rich enough to sustain farming any longer, and most of those parcels were used for woodlots for areas of springs and in the village.
But you were not born and raised here.
I was not. I was actually born in rural Virginia, in the Piedmont area, in a little town called Warrenton. My father was an Episcopal minister and had a parish in Remington, Virginia, and Brandy Station when I was very young. And subsequently, we moved to Richmond. My father worked with the diocese to develop the very first senior housing, nursing home, retirement facility for the Diocese of Virginia, which was then built in Alexandria. And he was the first administrator there, and so I spent a number of years of my childhood growing up in Virginia.
And how did you come to East Hampton?
Well, that's kind of a convoluted story. During my college years, summer times I would work as on a fishing boat charter mate, fishing off the Virginia Capes for marlin and tuna, and up in Chesapeake Bay for any number of the other local species, including fluke. And during that time, I worked for a charter captain who was also a band director during the off-season in the local schools, and he married a high school classmate of mine who I was in the jazz band with at the time, and she happened to be a roommate with my then soon-to-be wife, as it turned out. So we met on the Eastern Shore and courted and married, and she took a job with the University of Rhode Island as assistant director of bands and was in charge of their marching band. And we moved to Rhode Island, and I had been in the building business and had my own building company, which I started in Rhode Island, and we lived there for about 4 years. The last economic downturn was in '87 with that market crash. The university decided not to tenure anyone on a tenure track, and they rolled over all the positions as a cost-saving measure. And the building industry had slowed, and we were looking for somewhere else to live. And we liked where we were in Rhode Island, but so we knew we wanted to be close to the water. I had been a licensed charter captain already for a decade, and so we were tied to the water. And we came
I know
over.
that feeling. I've been tied to the water all my life.
So there was she looked at different universities and other places, and she's from Long Island originally. She grew up in the Three Village area of Scoyoc-East, Stony Brook, and so we were familiar with coming to visit, and happened to see that there was a one-year leave replacement ad in the East Hampton High School for a band director. And we thought, well, she would check it out. And we came to town, and she interviewed and was called back for a second interview and was offered the position. And we ended up looking for a place to rent and decided to do a winter rental, since we weren't sure that the position would be available after that. Mm-hmm. And there was someone who wanted to rent to a teacher, had left a number with the school district, and we called the number and went to Buckets and got some sandwiches and just decided to drive around town and look around. And we kind of ended up down in Alewife Brook Road on Northwest Harbor, had our lunch, and there were some the DEC researchers checking for scallops, and they were claiming it was going to be a bumper year that year. And we went back to town, called the number, got directions, followed it back out the same route we had just driven by sort of chance, and ended up renting a little ranch house on Northwest Road, interestingly enough. And after the owner decided that we were suitable renters, they asked us if there was any relation between my last name and the names on the gravestones in the cemetery nearby.
Wow.
So we actually ended up living in the first house that we lived here on what was the Van Scoy farm. So it was kind of a strange coincidence.
Yeah, at that point you actually didn't know that your family was from there?
I knew because of our family genealogical records that there was a tie to East Hampton. That was sort of in the background in my mind. And of course, when they pointed out that there was a cemetery, I went and looked at the cemetery. I got out our family records and looked through. I was completely kind of shocked and intrigued by that, and proceeded to spend the better part of the next year, my free time, looking through the Long Island collection at the library and researching family history and history of the town, and was intrigued by that right from the start.
I can imagine. I would be intrigued too. I wish I had roots back down here. Unfortunately, I don't. I would like to know something about how you got involved, because I know you have quite a record in town politics. How did that come about?
That started pretty early. In 1991, as I said, I'd spent a fair amount of my free time poring through historical records in the town, And the one thing that I found most interesting about the town immediately is the public's right of access to our beaches. And in many communities, beachfronts have been privatized completely, and or the access to beaches. And so that was something that was very unique about our town. And at the time, there were some threats against those rights of access, and I got involved and ran for trustee at that time. So that was part of the initial impetus for me to get involved. And later on in '95, I was asked if I would serve on the zoning board. I had a building background and a land use, background to some degree. So I did accept that.
And how long did you?
I served 5 years. It's a 5-year term. I was appointed for a full term, and my last year I spent as chairman of the board.
And how did you get on the planning?
Well, I actually had been asked if I would be interested in serving in some other capacity after my term was up on the zoning board. And at the time, my children were, I have a daughter, Amy, and a son, Thomas. They were at ages where there was a lot of little league and after-school activities. They were at an age where I thought it was very important to try and spend as much time with them as I could, and spend time coaching soccer, youth soccer, and softball and little league with my kids and pursuing other activities. So I kind of wanted to take that time away from the public service and kind of focus on my children some more. So then, in 2006, I believe it was, I was asked then if I would be interested in serving on the planning board, and I accepted. My children, are in high school and had their own activities that they were very happy to pursue.
Yes, we all know about that.
Parental involvement being necessary. So I was kind of off the hook to some degree with that, and they're starting to drive and whatnot. So
yes,
I had a little more free time, and thought it would be an interesting challenge and a way of giving back to the community and trying to.
Yes, I know about your planning board because I was working with a group when we were trying to petition not to have a cell phone tower at Camp Blue Bay, and appeared with in front of you guys at the planning board, and it was very interesting to watch how the planning board works.
Basically, the goal of the planning board is to allow for the orderly development of the town, really taking a longer view and maybe a broader view of the impacts of whatever somebody might propose for land use. So it's really meant to be a way of kind of guiding and mitigating any kind of potential impacts, and to bring a balance. There are private property rights, and then there are also needs and rights of the community at large. And so it's really a matter of trying to focus on what kind of impacts might be created and to try and balance those different competing needs and interests.
Right, that's very interesting because I was a member of the Democratic Screening Committee, and when you first came to us, I think the thing that attracted me to you was the way you did talk about balance, the balance between economic growth and development and maintaining the quality of life. Would you like to speak a little bit?
It's really important to recognize, first of all, that those of us who live here and work here need to be able to sustain ourselves. And so, local business is an important part of our community. Local businesses contribute in very powerful and important ways to our sense of community, fundraisers for those in need. They're very important. So we need to keep sight of what the needs of the business community is, and we also need to keep in sight, the amazing place that we live and how important it is to protect those natural assets that we have and those positive things about where we live. So, I think there are ways to address both of those. They don't have to be mutually exclusive, in terms of moving forward.